All right, folks, buckle up, because today we're diving headfirst into some seriously deep philosophical waters. We're talking heaven and hell, and we're going to tackle these ideas in a way that'll really get those philosophical gears turning, especially for you, our listener, who loves a good thought experiment.
You got it. We're not going to shy away from the complexities here. We've got some fascinating stuff from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, their entry on heaven and hell in Christian thought. And trust me, this stuff is packed with enough philosophical fuel to keep us debating for, well, probably an eternity.
Okay, so let's be upfront here. We're not aiming to hand over all the answers on a silver platter. This isn't about definitively cracking the code of the afterlife. Think of it more like a philosophical playground, A
Yeah.
place where we can kind of wrestle with those really big, maybe even unanswerable questions.
Exactly. We're going to dig into those thorny issues that philosophers love to get their teeth into. Free will, justice, what even is happiness, really, all through the lens of these ancient concepts, heaven and hell.
And one thing that really struck me as we were getting ready for this deep dive is how the whole idea of an afterlife, it isn't just some fluffy religious notion,
Yeah.
It actually comes from a very real philosophical problem.
Right. It's a problem that's been bugging philosophers for ages. The Stanford Encyclopedia piece lays it out really well. If this life is all we get, then how do we make sense of all the suffering, all the terrible things that happen, alongside the idea of a just and loving God?
Like, if there's no final reckoning, no balancing of the scales beyond this world, how can we even begin to comprehend why some people seem to get away with so much while others suffer for seemingly no reason?
It cuts to the core, doesn't it? It makes you question morality, what it even means to be human. And this isn't a uniquely Christian dilemma either. This has bothered thinkers across all sorts of cultures and belief systems for a very long time.
So we're definitely not talking about like who gets a fluffy cloud versus who gets poked with a pitchfork for eternity.
Definitely not. That kind of simplistic reward-punishment idea totally misses the depth and complexity of how these concepts have been thought about, especially in the Christian tradition.
Good, because honestly, that whole fire and brimstone imagery always felt a bit too cartoonish to me. So if we're moving beyond those oversimplifications, where do we even begin? How do we unpack these concepts in a way that's philosophically meaningful?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia does a great job of outlining three main perspectives on the afterlife within Christian thought. Each one, well, they've got their own philosophical strengths and weaknesses, and they all struggle with that same basic question: how to reconcile a loving God with the existence of suffering and evil in the world.
Ooh, this sounds like it's going to be a philosophical showdown. Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more. What are these three competing visions of what happens after we die?
Imagine it's a boxing match, yeah. Three heavyweights in the ring of philosophical theology. In one corner, you've got the Augustinian view, named after St. Augustine of Hippo. In the other corner, we've got the Arminian view, named after Jacobus Arminius. And then, as kind of a wild card, you've got the Universalist perspective.
Okay, those names aren't exactly the most catchy, but I'm definitely intrigued. Let's break them down, starting with Augustine's view. What's the gist of that?
So the Augustinian view, it all hinges on the idea that, in the end, God's love is going to win. But it's a love that's specifically for, I guess you could say, a select few, like a VIP list for heaven. Everyone else, well, they're facing eternal separation from God, and that's often what's described as hell.
So it's like some cosmic sorting hat, deciding who's in and who's out. And if God is supposed to be all-loving, how can he choose some and not others? Especially, before they've even had a chance to live their lives.
You're getting right to the heart of it. This gets into one of the most controversial parts of Augustine's theology: predestination. He believed that God, with his infinite knowledge, has already picked who will be saved and who will be damned even before we're born. And this ties into his whole concept of original sin, the idea that because of Adam's sin, we all inherit this, like this inherent guilt, and we all deserve punishment.
Wow, talk about starting life with the odds stacked against you. But doesn't that just completely blow up free will and the idea that we're responsible for our actions? If it's all predestined, then are we really making choices at all?
Exactly. This is where the Augustinian view really forces you to think, to confront the limits of what we can even understand about God's power and how much freedom we actually have.
It's like, if God is pulling all the strings, then are we really actors in this drama, or are we just like puppets dancing to his tune? It just doesn't seem to fit with how we experience our own lives, our own sense that our choices matter.
It's a tension that Augustine himself wrestled with, and it's one that continues to be debated by theologians and philosophers today.
Okay, so Augustine's view has this like limited guest list for heaven.
Hmm.
What about the Arminian perspective? What's their take on things?
Arminianism, it's a bit more optimistic, I guess, at least when it comes to who gets into heaven. They emphasize that God's love is for everyone, no exceptions, but it's up to each individual to choose whether or not to accept that love.
So it's less about God choosing us and more about us choosing God. It puts more emphasis on our agency, on the power of our decisions to shape our eternal destiny.
Exactly. Arminians believe God gives us a real, genuine choice, and he respects that choice, even if it means we choose to be separated from him. Hell, in this view, it's not so much God punishing us as it is a consequence that we choose for ourselves.
Interesting. So God sets the table, but it's up to us whether we decide to pull up a chair and feast or just walk away and stay hungry. But then what about all the people who never even got a chance to hear about the feast in the first place? What about those born into circumstances where they never even had a real opportunity to know God? Or, what about people who die before they can make a conscious choice?
It's one of the tough questions Arminianism has to grapple with. Is it really fair to hold someone accountable for a choice they never truly had the opportunity to make? It's a tricky one.
Right. It's kind of like saying someone's guilty for not showing up to a party they were never invited to in the first place.
Hmm.
So both the Augustinian and Arminian views, they've got some philosophical wrinkles that need ironing out. But before we get too lost in those, tell me, what's the universalist perspective? How does it all fit into this?
Now, universalism, that's where things get really interesting. It's the most radical of the three, you could say, and it offers a view of the afterlife that's both incredibly hopeful, but also potentially pretty controversial. The main idea here is that God's love is so powerful, so all-encompassing, that it will ultimately win over everyone, no matter what.
Wait, so no one gets left behind in this scenario?
Yeah.
Everyone's going to the cosmic party, even if they spent their whole lives RSVPing no.
That's the basic idea, yeah.
Yeah.
Universalists believe that even what we might call hell, even divine judgment, it's all part of this bigger plan. It's all ultimately an expression of love and mercy. Like it's a way of guiding us, maybe even pushing us, but always toward this ultimate goal of being reconciled with God.
Okay, so it's less about fire and brimstone and more about like a cosmic hug that eventually pulls everyone in.
Yeah.
I like that imagery a lot better. But how does that work with free will? If everyone is ultimately compelled to be with God, even those who seemingly reject him, doesn't that negate the idea that we can actually choose?
That is the million-dollar question, philosophically speaking. Can true reconciliation happen without stepping all over our freedom to choose? It's a real head-scratcher.
So even in this seemingly most hopeful view of the afterlife, we're still wrestling with those fundamental philosophical questions about free will and how much God's in control. It seems like you can't really talk about the afterlife without bumping into these concepts.
You're absolutely right. And the deeper we go into each of these perspectives, the more tangled up those questions become. But before we jump into the details of each one, let's step back for a second and look more closely at the Augustinian view of hell. Can it really hold up when you examine it philosophically?
Right, let's put Augustine's idea of eternal punishment under the philosophical microscope and see if it survives. I'm ready for some intellectual fireworks.
So with Augustine, his vision of hell, it's all about this idea of retribution. It's not just punishing bad actions, it's more like balancing things out, like some cosmic scale of justice has to be evened out.
It's like an eye for an eye, but with like infinite consequences. That's pretty intense.
Exactly. And you remember Anselm, right? His famous argument. He was convinced that because you're offending an infinite God, any offense becomes infinitely serious. So infinite punishment is the only thing that makes sense.
Wait a minute. Does that logic really hold up? Does the severity of a crime only depend on who you're doing it against? Like stealing a candy bar is wrong, but does that really deserve eternal damnation? Especially, what if the person was starving or something? Doesn't the context, the intent matter at all?
You're getting at something really important there. That's one of the big philosophical problems with this strict payback kind of justice. Should we consider the sinner's intent, what they knew, their circumstances? Is it really fair to just slam down an infinite punishment for any sin, no matter how big or small, no matter why it was done?
Right, it seems like that would just make the idea of proportionate justice totally meaningless. And, we were talking about Augustine earlier and how he believed even babies who weren't baptized were condemned. I'm still having trouble seeing how that fits with any idea of fairness or responsibility.
You're hitting on another big philosophical snag with Augustine's view. This idea of inherited guilt. A lot of philosophers really struggle with this because it raises these questions about whether we can really be held accountable for what other people do, especially stuff that happened before we were even born.
It just seems wrong to punish someone for something they had zero control over. Like, imagine getting a life sentence for a crime you didn't commit just because, I don't know, a distant relative did it or something.
Exactly. And this brings us to the core of the debate about Augustine's vision of hell. It forces us to ask these huge questions about free will, about what fair punishment even means, about God's mercy. It's heavy stuff.
So, if this whole strict retribution model is running into some problems, philosophically speaking, are there other ways of thinking about God's justice? Maybe ones that make more sense when we're talking about hell?
Absolutely, there are. And one view that really contrasts with Augustine's is what you find with people like George MacDonald. He believed that true justice, it's not about punishment at all. It's about restoring harmony.
So it's less about balancing the scales and more about, like, healing the damage, the brokenness that's been caused. I like the sound of that a lot better.
MacDonald had this great line. He said, "Suffering weighs nothing at all against sin." What he meant was that just inflicting pain, that doesn't really solve anything. If God is truly loving, he'd be more concerned with healing, with bringing everyone back to him, not just doling out punishment.
That's a powerful idea. It changes the whole focus, right? It's not about retribution. It's about fixing what's broken.
Yeah,
God's not like some angry judge. He's more like a cosmic doctor trying to heal us.
exactly. And, this actually resonates with a lot of what we're seeing in discussions about justice today. There's this whole movement towards what's called restorative justice, which emphasizes rehabilitation, making things right between people rather than just locking people up.
It makes you wonder, if we're changing how we think about justice here on Earth, shouldn't our ideas about God's justice also change? Maybe our current ideas about hell are just like stuck in the past, based on old-fashioned ideas about punishment that we're moving away from.
That's a really interesting thought. It makes us question whether our ideas about God are really about God or if they're just reflecting our own cultural biases and limitations.
So we've got Augustine's hell as eternal punishment. Then we've got this MacDonald idea about restoring things, bringing everyone back together.
Hmm.
Where does the Arminian view fit into this whole discussion about justice, especially with their focus on free will?
Arminianism, it presents a different kind of challenge because for them, it all comes down to human freedom. If we truly have the power to choose, then we also have the power to choose separation from God, even forever.
So it's not so much God sending us to hell, it's more like we're choosing to exile ourselves from him. Like we're cutting ourselves off from the source of all love and goodness, even though we don't have to.
Exactly. And this leads to a really mind-boggling question. Can someone actually choose eternal misery? It seems almost impossible to imagine, right? Like, it goes against everything we understand about how humans work. To make sense of this, we need to get into the weeds a bit with the idea of free will itself.
Okay, let's do it. Let's talk about free will. What are some of the philosophical arguments around it, especially when we're talking about the possibility of choosing hell?
Well, philosophers who believe in both free will and God, they're often called free will theists, and they've come up with some pretty interesting answers to this problem. One common answer is that it's possible to make a choice for evil that can't ever be undone.
So like a soul permanently choosing to turn away from God, no chance of ever coming back. That's a dark thought.
Thinkers like Jerry Walls, they argue that people in hell, they've made a final decision to reject God. They're so stuck in their rebellion that they don't even want reconciliation anymore. Their hearts are hardened, they can't experience love or repentance. It's like they've chosen a path that leads them further and further away.
But doesn't that mean they're not really free anymore? If they can't change, if they're locked into that choice, does it even count as free will?
That's a great point, and it shows the tension between this idea of eternal damnation and true freedom. Some people might say that true freedom means you can choose badly, even if it means choosing your own destruction. It's tragic, for sure, but it fits with the idea that our choices have consequences that can last forever, that we can ultimately choose to cut ourselves off from what's good.
It's hard to imagine, that a God who loves us would allow us to make a choice that could lead to eternal suffering. It just seems to contradict everything we think we know about his compassion.
It's a tough one, no doubt, and it's led some of these free will theists to come up with different explanations for how someone could choose hell. One idea is that even in hell, the chance to turn back to God, to repent, never really goes away.
So even if you've made what seems like the wrong choice, there's always this possibility of being redeemed that feels a lot more hopeful.
Thinkers like David Berneroff and Joseph Plug, they suggest that God is so merciful that he'll always leave the door open, even for those in hell. They say that true free will requires that we can always choose differently no matter what we've done in the past.
So it's like a divine open door policy, right? An invitation to come back home no matter how far you've strayed.
Exactly. It's a picture of a God who never gives up on us, even when we keep messing up. This also brings up some really interesting questions about time and eternity. If time goes on forever, does that mean we have infinite chances to repent, to turn things around?
That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. We're talking about free will, God's mercy, and how reality itself works, all wrapped up together. And we haven't even gotten to that third explanation for choosing hell, the Molinist view and transworld damnation, which honestly sounds kind of terrifying.
Yes, Molinism. Now, things are going to get a little more complex, so bear with me. We'll try to keep it from getting too jargony.
Hit me with it. I'm ready to go deep on this Molinist stuff. What's this transworld damnation all about?
Okay, so Molinism comes from Luis de Molina, this 16th century Jesuit priest and philosopher who had a very specific way of understanding how God knows things and how that relates to human freedom.
Sounds like we're about to do some serious philosophical weightlifting here. I'm ready.
So Molina, he said God has this special kind of knowledge. He called it middle knowledge. This means that God knows everything that's happened, everything that will happen, and he knows what every single creature would freely choose in every possible situation.
So it's like God's got this cosmic playbook, right? He knows every possible move, how every player would act in any scenario. That's some serious power.
Right. And this middle knowledge, it allows God to create a world where we have real free will, but he also understands all the potential outcomes of our choices.
Okay, I see where this is going. How does that relate to choosing hell, though?
Well, one of the most famous Molinists today, a guy named William Lane Craig, he uses this whole framework to argue for something called transworld damnation.
Transworld damnation. Okay, that sounds intense. What does that even mean?
Basically, it means that some people, they're so fundamentally opposed to God, so set against his love, that no matter what situation they're in, they'd always choose to reject him, even if it meant eternal separation.
So they're like eternally incompatible with God. No matter what, there's just no way for them to ever be with him. That's a tough one to wrap your head around.
It is. It suggests that there are limits to even God's power to reconcile everyone to himself. Some people, through their own choices, they put themselves outside the reach of his grace permanently.
But that brings up another question, right? If God knows ahead of time that some people will choose damnation, why even create them? It seems almost, I don't know, I mean, like he's setting them up to fail.
That's a common criticism of this idea, and Craig actually talks about it directly. He says basically we can't fully understand God's reasons, but maybe, he says, the existence of those who choose damnation, maybe it somehow contributes to a greater good. Maybe it lets more people be in heaven, or maybe it makes God's love and mercy stand out even more because we see the alternative.
So like the suffering of a few is justified because it benefits the many. That seems like a kind of cold way to look at divine justice, you know?
It's a really complicated argument, ethically speaking, and a lot of philosophers and theologians just aren't convinced. It raises this question of whether the ends can ever justify the means, especially when we're talking about eternal destinies.
Okay, so we've gone through Augustine's hell as punishment and all these free will ideas about how we can choose poorly, even the Molinist view. It seems like you can't talk about hell without also talking about free will, and that whole concept is just full of philosophical puzzles.
You got it. And this leads us to something interesting we haven't touched on yet. We've been talking a lot about hell, about rejecting God. But what about heaven? If everyone there is perfectly happy, always in tune with God, is there really any freedom left?
Ooh, that's a great point. If everyone is always choosing what's good, does it even count as a choice? Is there even a difference between good and evil in a place of perfect bliss?
It's like asking, if someone is so honest they wouldn't even think about stealing, are they really being free when they choose not to steal? Or, another way to think about it, imagine a mother who loves her baby so much she could never hurt them. Is she really choosing freely when she doesn't hurt her child?
These are really making me think. We're talking about the very definition of freedom and how it works in different situations. Is freedom about having choices, even bad ones? Or is it about being in tune with what's good and fulfilling?
And if heaven is about being completely aligned with God's will, does that mean our choices don't matter anymore? Or do they take on some other kind of meaning?
It's like we're exploring the boundaries of freedom, what it can and can't do, and how it might lead to ultimate fulfillment. We're back to that age-old question, what does it really mean to be free?
And by looking at all these different ideas about heaven and hell, we're also uncovering deeper truths about ourselves, about how we relate to God. It's a journey inward as much as outward.
This deep dive is really making us think big, isn't it? We're not just talking about some abstract theology. We're talking about what it means to be human, to make choices, to try to understand why things are the way they are.
It's a journey that can be exciting intellectually and spiritually, you know? We're facing the limits of what we know, but also embracing the wonder of what we don't know.
Okay, before we get too lost in the clouds here, let's bring it back down to earth for a second with a very human problem. What about our loved ones? If someone in heaven knows that someone they love is suffering eternally in hell, can they really be happy?
That's a really powerful question, and it shows the tension between feeling bliss yourself and knowing that someone else is hurting. It goes back to the idea that love connects us, that our well-being is tied up with the well-being of those we care about.
Earlier, we mentioned Ted Bundy's mother, how she loved him so much even though he did awful things. It's hard to imagine her finding peace if she thought he was being eternally punished.
This really challenges the traditional image of heaven, you know, as this place of perfect happiness where you're not affected by any of the bad stuff in the world. Can you really experience true joy if you know someone you love is in pain, especially forever?
Some might say that God could just erase those memories, right? Create a kind of blissful ignorance in heaven. But wouldn't that be like a kind of trickery, shielding us from the truth?
That's the dilemma, right? Is real happiness based on seeing reality clearly, even the painful parts? Or is it possible to experience a joy so deep that it transcends the suffering of others? Maybe what we think of as happiness in the afterlife needs to be totally different from how we understand it here.
And what about God? If he knows everything and loves everyone, how could he stand to see even one soul suffer eternally, let alone countless billions?
Those are huge questions that people have been wrestling with for centuries. Some theologians, like Jonathan Edwards, even suggested that the suffering of those in hell would actually make the joy of those in heaven even greater, because they'd be even more grateful for God's mercy and justice.
Wow, that's a pretty intense viewpoint. It's like using the suffering of others to increase your own happiness. That's a hard one to accept.
It definitely challenges our moral intuitions, doesn't it? It makes you wonder if it's even possible to reconcile that kind of view with a God who is all loving and compassionate. It shows how different people can have such radically different ideas about divine justice and what role suffering plays in the grand scheme of things. Maybe there's a deeper understanding of love and suffering that we just can't grasp right now.
Okay, so we've got this tension between being happy yourself and knowing others are suffering, and we even touched on this idea that some people might actually see others suffering as a way to make their own joy greater. The traditional picture of heaven is definitely being put to the test here.
And there's one more thing to think about. This idea that even eternal life, even in heaven, might eventually get boring.
Oh, you're bringing up the eternity is boring argument. I've heard that one before, but how does that work philosophically?
Well, philosophers like Bernard Williams, they've argued that living forever, even in a perfect place, might become unbearable after a while. They say that after a certain point, we'd run out of new things to experience, new ways to grow, and it would just become this endless loop of the same stuff.
It's like being stuck in a rut, but forever.
Yeah.
The idea of doing the same things over and over again, even if they're enjoyable, it does seem like it would lose its appeal after a while.
It makes us ask, what makes life meaningful? Can eternal life really be meaningful? Is there some limit to how much joy and growth we can experience? Or is there a way to imagine eternity that's both blissful and constantly engaging?
It's like we're trying to imagine something we've never experienced, a state of being that goes beyond our limits, where there's always something new and exciting. It's definitely a challenge to our imaginations, but it also speaks to that deep desire we all have for something more, something that lasts beyond this life.
One way to think about it is to consider God and his infinite creativity. If God is truly infinite, couldn't he create endless experiences, whole new worlds for us to explore? Wouldn't that mean there's always something new and amazing to discover?
That's a really encouraging thought. It means that heaven wouldn't be some static place, but this ongoing journey of discovery and growth, always being shaped by God's boundless imagination.
Like a never-ending adventure. And maybe that's what this life is about, preparing us for that. It's about refining our souls, expanding our capacity for love, for knowledge, for wonder, so that we can fully participate in that grand adventure.
I love that way of looking at it. It gives a whole new meaning to our time here on Earth. It's not just a test to see where we end up, but training for something much bigger, much more fulfilling. It's like we're being invited to join in this cosmic dance, and this life is the rehearsal. We're learning the steps, getting ready for the main performance in eternity.
It's a beautiful image, and it shows how transformative this deep dive can be. We're not just dealing with abstract ideas, we're on a journey of self-discovery, of spiritual growth. We're understanding ourselves better, understanding the universe better, understanding God better.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Different views on hell, the mysteries of free will, even what it means to be free and fulfilled in heaven. But we haven't talked about the universalist view in a while.
You're right. Let's circle back to that and see how it deals with some of these philosophical questions we've been talking about. Remember, universalism says that in the end, God's love wins and everyone is reconciled to him.
So everyone gets a happy ending, no eternal suffering, no one left out in the cold.
Exactly. It's a vision of ultimate hope, but it raises some questions about things like grace and justice.
Okay, let's get into that. How does universalism fit with God being just? If there's no ultimate punishment for bad actions, doesn't that minimize how serious sin is?
Universalists would say that true justice isn't about punishing, it's about restoring. They believe that even God's judgment is ultimately an act of mercy, something that guides us towards being reconciled to him.
So it's like a parent disciplining their child, right?
Yeah.
It's not about anger or hurting them. It's about helping them grow and become better.
That's a good analogy. Universalists see God as being motivated by love in everything he does, even when that involves suffering or consequences. It's not an easy concept to understand, especially when we're used to thinking about justice as punishment.
And what about free will? If God's love is going to win everyone over eventually, how does that work with our ability to choose freely?
That's the big question for universalists, isn't it? Can true reconciliation happen without forcing people?
So we're trying to balance God's love, which is supposed to be irresistible, with our ability to make real choices. That's a tricky dance.
Absolutely. Maybe figuring out that dance is part of the journey. Maybe we as humans can't fully grasp how divine love and justice work, especially when we're talking about eternity. It's just too big for us to fully understand.
It's like trying to fit the ocean into a teacup. Our language, our ideas, how we think, maybe it's all just too small to fully grasp what happens after this life. But that doesn't mean we should stop trying, does it? Asking these questions, pushing the limits of our understanding, that can be incredibly enriching for our minds and our spirits.
I agree completely, and I think that's a great place to stop for part 2. We've explored some really fascinating ideas, and in part 3, we'll pull all this together and look at some final questions, things that'll hopefully keep you thinking about heaven and hell long after we're done.
Wow, I feel like we've been on a mental marathon here, exploring all these different ideas about heaven and hell. My brain's definitely feeling the burn. Yeah, it's amazing how something that seems so simple on the surface can lead to such deep philosophical questions. Huh?
Yeah.
It really makes you realize how powerful ideas can be, how they can challenge what we think we know and make us see things in a whole new way.
You know, one thing that really struck me throughout this whole deep dive is how all these different views on the afterlife, they all come back to this one basic question. What is God's love really like, and how does it work with our human freedom?
That's so true. It's like we've been wrestling with this tension between God's power and our own choices the whole time. It's like this cosmic puzzle with all these pieces. Justice, mercy, free will, eternal destiny. How do they all fit together?
Right. And what's fascinating is that there's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution. Each of these perspectives, whether it's Augustine's, Arminius's, or the universalist view, they all offer a different way of understanding how God and humanity relate. And each one comes with its own set of philosophical challenges that honestly we could spend lifetimes trying to figure out.
It's humbling, isn't it? It reminds you that these are mysteries that have puzzled people for centuries. And maybe that's part of what makes it so captivating. It's an invitation to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep trying to understand these really profound ideas, even if we never come up with all the answers.
I love that. It's like we've been given this glimpse into this incredibly intricate tapestry, and we're just starting to see how complex and beautiful it really is. Even the small parts we've been able to examine have revealed so much depth and wonder.
It's a journey that takes us to the very heart of what it means to be human, to face the unknown, to search for meaning and purpose, and to long for something bigger than ourselves. And whether we find comfort in the idea of a loving God who welcomes us all home, or we struggle with the implications of being eternally separated from that source of love, the very act of asking these questions can change us in profound ways. So true. It's not about reaching some final destination. It's about the journey itself, about the growth and understanding we gain along the way. It's about opening our minds and hearts to the mystery of it all. And who knows, maybe in that very act of questioning and seeking, we're already connecting to something greater than ourselves, even if we can't fully grasp it with our limited human understanding.
And for our listeners who love to dig deep and think philosophically, that's the real treasure here, right? We're not giving you a set of ready-made answers, but we're giving you the tools to keep exploring, keep wrestling with these complex ideas, and ultimately come to your own conclusions.
It's like we've been given all these different lenses, and each one shows us the same landscape in a new way. By looking through all these different lenses, we get a much richer, more nuanced understanding of the terrain.
Exactly. And as we keep exploring, keep questioning, keep pondering, we're also becoming more self-aware, more open to wonder and awe.
So well said. And for those of you out there who are still thinking about all of this, we want to leave you with one final thought, something that we didn't find a direct answer to in our sources, but something that came up in our own discussions.
If hell really is part of God's loving plan, as some believe, what does that tell us about suffering and redemption? And if we really do have the freedom to choose between heaven and hell, what kind of freedom must we have for that choice to truly matter?
Those are big questions, and we hope you'll keep wrestling with them as you continue on your own philosophical journey. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mysteries of heaven and hell. We hope you found it as thought-provoking and mind-expanding as we did. Until next time, keep exploring and keep those philosophical gears turning.